name's James Wiltz. I am a local advocate and also author of a recent book on the Winnipeg Police. So I'm here to speak in my capacity as a researcher and as an activist. So specifically, I'm here to oppose the proposed increase to the Winnipeg Police Service budget of $15.1 million in mill rate spending, reaching $293.1 million in 2025. Specifically, I'm calling for the WPS budget to be frozen at 2024 levels and for proposed additional spending to be reallocated to actual safety solutions, starting with refunding the community connection space at the Millennium Library. I'm thus asking police board members to consider pushing back against WPS demands for more than $40 million per year more in mill rate support by 2027 and reflect on the broader mandate of the police board itself. So there's several prongs of this mandate that I'd like to focus on today as the proposed police budget is considered. And to do so, of course, it's necessary to return to the Provincial Police Services Act that determines the responsibilities of the board. Firstly, is found in Section 27A of the Act, which requires the board to provide, quote, civilian governance respecting the enforcement of law, the maintenance of the public peace, and the prevention of crime in the municipality. So my contention here is that there's no empirical evidence that increased police funding as proposed in this budget is the best way to advance this goal. As the police force constantly tells us in their statistical reports and media statements, issues of violence and harm continue to increase year after year. A study published in October 2023 that reviewed a decade's worth of data in 20 of Canada's largest cities concluded that there was, quote, no consistent correlation between police funding and crime rates across municipalities, end quote. Even if police presence in a specific instance successfully deters a violent or harmful act in a particular place and time, which itself is, of course, incredibly contingent and uncertain, as we've seen with acts of violence happening literally outside police headquarters, that does not mean that the issue is by any means resolved. Instead, it can oftentimes be displaced elsewhere with the risk factors that contribute to the act of violence or harm completely unaddressed. And it's my contention that this does not constitute meaningful prevention in any long-term sense. In many more cases, police only respond after an act of violence or harm has occurred, or after, quote, public peace has been breached, in the words of the legislation. So this means, for example, that an assault or a robbery has already taken place and that the victims may be suffering in any number of ways. And if the person who caused this harm is eventually found by police, which of course there's no guarantee of at all based on the Winnipeg Police's own clearance rates, subsequent criminalization does nothing to advance long-term safety. Many people come out of incarceration or out of community corrections with greatly worsened access to housing, employment, and supports, oftentimes leaving them few options to survive. And unsurprisingly, such conditions can frequently lead to cycles of further harm and criminalization. So once again, this does not represent improvement of public peace or prevention of violence as outlined in the legislation. I'd now like to turn to Section 27B of the Police Services Act, which requires the police board to provide the, quote, administrative direction and organization required to provide an adequate and effective police service in the municipality. Now, quite notably, this concept of adequate and effective policing is not defined anywhere in the legislation. In the 2020 review of the legislation by the so-called Community Safety Knowledge Alliance wrote that, quote, nowhere in Manitoba's legislation or regulations is adequate and effective policing defined. So this lack of definition has not been rectified since and means that this metric is essentially entirely discretionary. There's no stated goal, measurement, or ability to evaluate evidence against invested resources. So this major gap has meant that the so-called POP to COP or officer to civilian ratio has become the dominant metric that is used by the police and council to justify increased police funding. However, once again, there is no actual evidence behind this metric nor identification of a desired ratio for safety goals. And this is especially noticeable when we take a look at other major cities in Canada. Winnipeg reportedly has a ratio of 167.5 officers per 100,000 civilians. However, in 2023, Ottawa had 131.5, the Peel region had 144.3, Calgary had 153.1, Toronto had 167.8, Edmonton had 177.9, Vancouver with 184.1, and Montreal had 221.1. So I asked, which of these is the police board actually aiming for, and based on what empirical evidence? And what about the ongoing civilianization of police duties, which inevitably reduces the pop to cop ratio? Or the reality that 1,300 WPS employees make at least $100,000 a year, not including their enormous pension costs, which obviously reduces the ability for new hires? These are extremely basic questions that the police board and city council should be required to answer before giving the police force tens of millions of dollars more every year. The police board was not designed to be a blatant cheerleader and promoter of police force interests, or to merely accept police demands for funding without question or pushback. Yet only last week, we saw two members of this board, both Mayor Gillingham and Councillor Chambers, publicly promote the police force's desire for a new $13.5 million helicopter, only months after minor scandals about its second armored vehicle and its robot dog. The supposed mandate of the police board is to act as a liaison between the community and the police force, not automatically defending the police force against criticism from the community. If improved safety for all is a shared goal, which I'm sure it is, then continually increasing police funding at the direct expense of alternative safety solutions should be of profound concern to us all. And of course, ultimately, it is not the police board that determines the police budget, but it's city council. However, the police board offers the first opportunity to develop a distinct safety approach. I call especially on the non-council members of this police board to step up and push back against the incessant pro-police feelings of your council colleagues. There are many other avenues of improving safety and preventing violence and harm from occurring, rather than just continuing to dump more and more resources into reacting through policing, which occurs often in highly unequal and harmful ways. Such alternative approaches can begin with significantly increasing funding to community supports, starting with a community connection space at the Millennium Library, but also including dedicated youth programming and employment opportunities, safe and deeply affordable housing, and alternative non-police response options. And I know that the police board will contend that this is not within their purview, but such alternatives cannot be invested in unless police funding is frozen. Policing is an extremely expensive response to issues that are largely shaped by severe social inequalities that can be meaningfully addressed in many other and more effective ways. Rather than continue to go down this path of ever-increasing policing costs and activities, I encourage the non-council members of the police board to show courage and initiative in opposing this proposed funding increase and calling for alternative and effective approaches to safety in the city. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation this morning. Are there any questions of board members? Oh, go ahead, Diane.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Can you, I have two things. First is, can you let us know what is the name of your book that you referred to?
Sure, yeah,
and
yeah. Oh, go on, sorry.
And I'll just ask the second question and just let you go. The second one is, when you were doing your research, did you do research and compare that to other jurisdictions, or was it the city of Winnipeg only?
For sure. No, thanks for your questions. It feels weird to promote a book in the city, but it's called Dogged and Destructive Essays on the Winnipeg Police. It's published by ARP Books. And the objective of it is to take the opportunity of the centennial of the city of Winnipeg, but also the police force, to take a historical review and also try to learn from that in the contemporary context. In terms of my own research, it's predominantly focused on Winnipeg, but of course, any conversations that we have in Winnipeg has to occur within the national context and even international context. So, for example, in the case of thinking about the officer to population ratio, we look elsewhere as well. But the main focus of my research has been in Winnipeg specifically.
And sorry, just a follow-up question. Do you have any specific data, or is there anything within your book or current research around approaches, policing approaches in a as it relates to cost, like a cost benefit analysis when it comes to Indigenous people, or the role that the Winnipeg Police can play when it comes to the calls for action through Truth and Reconciliation?
For sure. Thank you for the question. So the main approach that I take to this is that policing is not the most efficient or effective means of resolving many of the issues that are in Winnipeg and in our various communities. So my contention and what's come from my research is that it is more prudent to reduce or at least freeze funding to the police and invest the resources that would otherwise go into policing into other safety solutions, such as alternative non-police crisis response, which has been talked about, or in providing the necessary, basic services that people need to survive so that they don't end up becoming trapped in these cycles of harm and criminalization. In terms of cost benefit analysis, I don't have that data specifically on hand, but I think at the very least, it's possible to reflect on the fact that some 1,300 members of the WPS make at least $100,000 per year in compensation, not including pensions. And if we compare that to other city services or nonprofits that are working in the city, often with very meager budgets, they are basically incomparable. And so I think that part of this problem is that the police have become sort of the de facto response to so many social crises, as they will often admit themselves. And what is needed is that for other departments, nonprofits, services, outreaches to receive similar levels of financial support so that they can begin to substitute and step into that role. So that would be my overarching response to that question.
And thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your time this morning, Mr. James Welts, and have a great day.